Here we are, hangar number 3, sock with camel. First went into flight, I believe, in 1917 and served with great distinction for the British Air Force in the First World War, believe it or not. I was just saying to my colleague that the Wright brothers only flew the very first plane like 10 years before that. So to go from that, where was that? In Wrightsville? I can't remember the name of the town where the Wright brothers flew, but it was a very low and short flight. To go from that to flying this around within 10 years is pretty awesome. This had a rotary engine. Because of that, and I need to be balanced really, really well, it was a very expensive plane. And when it's on the ground, being revved up, I've seen footage of it actually almost sort of dancing from side to side as the magnetos sort of go around and around. Really, really cool plane. Very stable, very manoeuvrable, fabric covered wings. Look at this. I can't touch it. I just want to touch it, but I cannot touch it. Look at that propeller. I don't know if you can see the carvings in it. It's just absolutely gorgeous work of art. Machine guns up the top there, which, believe it or not, were timed to fire in between rotations of those blades. Because you can imagine if they were just firing randomly as the propeller went round and round, you'd have just a whole heap of shredded wood on the front of your airplane there before too long at all. I'm not quite sure how boffins work those things out. That's way too mathematical for me. But somehow they've managed to time a round being fired from those machine guns with each rotation of the propeller. Pretty cool stuff. Tail dragger, and you had a pilot only in this one here. I don't know whether, in my reading, it said it didn't have a throttle or a carburetor, and really the only way to fly it was using something called a blip switch, which the pilot would press and it would cut the ignition for that time, and that was the only way it could be controlled. Please, if I'm wrong, write in, tell me, leave a comment, because I really do love to research these things, and I want to get it right. So please let me know if I've got that wrong. But an absolutely beautiful machine, and to be honest, probably the highlight of the entire thing for me as a military historian. That is just magnificent. Genesis said, if we turn around this way, few generations on, quite a few generations on, we have the F1-11, which served Australia with distinction for approximately 40-something years. It was bought from America in 1963 off the drawing board before any were actually ever built. We probably can't see it down here, but there's a white bracket on the on a plinth down there. That's something called a wing drop box or some such thing. It's a very important structural part of the airplane. Sits in the centre of the wings. These big lugs here is what actually held the wing on either side with this here. Now, when this plane was first put into service, I believe a few of them literally just fell apart, and it was a fault with this. And this delayed the delivery of the F1-11 to fighting status in the RAAF for many, many years. So there was a bit of controversy to this plane even before it saw any service. Very expensive as well. This problem was rectified, and the plane first came into service with the RAAF, I think in about 1973. And at the time, our Defence Minister, Mr. blah blah, someone inconsequential, said this should serve us through to the 80s and beyond. But I don't think anybody actually had any idea of exactly how far that beyond was. It actually retired from active service within the RAAF in 2011, so just a couple of years ago. Quite an awesome bit of kit, if I do say myself. The polymorphic wings, which means they're sort of set back against the plane's fuselage there at the moment, but they too come out to almost right angles depending on what the plane is doing. Massive big ailerons on the back there. Really awesome thing. See down the engines here, Might be a bit difficult to see, but if we can try and get a shot down there, it's really quite cool. It's a bit hard to get the perspective, but these planes are always deceptively big when you see them up in the sky. Yeah, okay, it doesn't look that big. Standing down next to them, they really are quite sizable machines, and just a few of the little bits and bobs and switches required here. This whole section here, the cockpit that the pilot and co-pilot excuse me, sat in, was an ejectable module, which we see just behind us here. So this whole thing, rather than it be an ejector seat as such, which is in the Mirage and various other fighter planes that we have around, this whole thing ejected from the top of the plane. From Vic, his information telling us before, not a single person was lost ejecting this way, and the people who were unfortunate enough to have to eject from their F1-11 in this, one I believe was a runway crash. An engine blew on takeoff and they weren't getting the lift, so they had to eject before the plane crashed into whatever it was at the end of the runway, and the other one was mid-air, but all crew survived and couldn't sing the praises of this little gadget high enough. Pretty cool, really. It lands in water, skirts will jettison from the sides, and it will float, and a whole heap of instantaneous reactions sort of take place the moment that ejection handle is pulled. Things are guillotined, explosives set off, and within like a quarter of a second or something, the thing is jettisoned from the thing. What I personally like, because I'm a coffee lover, over here, I can't go in there. Coffee flask, heated coffee flask. So while I'm flying my jet around for 8 hours, I've got my nice warm coffee, and that will keep me much happier. Come on, let's go and see the next thing. Here we have a Mirage, French-built, single engine. I don't actually know an awful lot about this plane, I do apologise. It was used for a number of years. I don't think it was necessarily that appropriate, and it was put out of service reasonably quickly. It's a lovely, slick looking thing though. Obviously a single engine, if you have any problems whatsoever, that's it, you got nothing else. So I think that was from the 60s through to the 70s that served. Over here is an Italian-made fighter plane. Largely used by the RAF for their Red Baron, their performing shows, which are really quite spectacular if you ever get a chance to see one. They really are really incredible, very talented pilots, having fun, it would seem, and why not? So that's quite a nice little thing, and if you've seen any of those flights, it's got quite a distinctive sort of wing shape here that's quite sort of particular. This over here, legendary plane. This is a Sabre. At the beginning of the Korean War, which was sort of in the 50s, not long after the Second World War finished, of course Cold War had started, Soviets versus the West, and then of course Korea, North Korea being communist, South Korea non-communist, North Korea invaded South, and we came to their defence, of course, against the Red Menace. Whatever we were flying before was being knocked out of the sky, left, right and centre. We had a requirement for a jet-powered fighter. There had been jet-powered fighters previous to this, the Messerschmitt 262, of course, which was the first jet-powered fighter, but then the war ended, so there really wasn't an awful lot of need to continue with that development until this baby was made. So the Russians came back with their MiG, which surprised everybody because they didn't realise the Russians had the ability to make such advanced planes. Toe-to-toe, I believe these two were actually quite similar in their abilities and manoeuvrability, speed, all those sorts of things. So a bit of a MiG, Sabre, stoush developed over Korea, and I think the Sabres came out on top. At the front they had cannons and machine guns, but their machine guns had a really, really high rate of fire, and so they were able to knock the MiGs off a little bit better than the MiGs were able to knock them off. And also I believe they started training their fighter pilots around this time. Instead of coming in straight behind from the rear where you're going to just get that rear sort of silhouette, to come in from 3/4 at the side, displaying the length of the side of the aircraft, so it increased your chances of hitting a target from like 30% to 60% or something like that. And I think that did have an effect as well. This particular plane though, it on its very last flight had an interesting incident. It made it back to base here, was parked up and never flew again. What had happened was the pilot of this plane at a place called Binnaburra, which is on the Gold Coast of Queensland here, the hinterland, unbeknownst to the Air Force, and particularly this pilot, obviously, they'd slung 3 quite large cables, electrical cables, communication cables across the valley there. He flew straight into them. This is an example here of the wire that was slung across the valley, so it's about 1 centimetre in diameter. It's probably lucky it didn't just cut the plane clear in half, but they have kept the damage sustained by the plane in situ, so you can see it. You can see the bottom cable cut through here, and corresponding on this side, apparently that cable snapped. The second cable sort of came up over the nose, damaged the, I believe it might have knocked his canopy off altogether. He couldn't then eject because in this plane the canopy is part of that ejection system. And continued up to the back where it's also sliced into the tail up the back there. It's going to be really quite difficult for you to see. But it's pretty cool to see the damage, and they've just left it like that, which I think is an awesome story. He decided he wasn't going to ditch, he was going to try and fly it back here. I don't know if he really had an awful lot of choice if he couldn't get out of it anyway. But flew it back here to Amberley, which is probably a distance of a couple of 100 kilometres, I would imagine. Parked it up, turned it off, and it never flew again. Vic also said that the gentleman, there's a photo of his helmet around there because it almost took the top of his helmet off, and you can see the grazing of the fibres and things in his helmet when we go around and have a look at the photograph. So I imagine he had a little bit of a headache. But after getting on the ground and being checked out by medics, you know, doing different assessments and things, within the hour his commander had him up in the air again in another Sabre. Get back on the horse, so to speak, or you're going to freeze and not be able to do it again. So that's pretty hardcore if you ask me. And I believe the pilot of this plane continued on in the Air Force to reach a really high rank of Air Marshal or some such thing, which is equivalent, Army equivalent to sort of like a general. Pretty cool stuff. So we'll go around here. There's some great engines up the back here. There's an F1-11 engine out of the fuselage, so you can see it. These here are the missiles that were able to be loaded on board this aircraft. As you can see, really, really quite big. They didn't use nuclear warheads here in Australia, but I believe the Americans did have missiles that were fitted with nuclear warheads. So they're both, I don't want either of these coming down on my house. They're both scary as hell looking, if you ask me. Again, quite intimidating being under this plane. It's deceptively big. These ailerons on the back are massive. Tail is, oh, that's got to be at least 5 metres up. The tip of the tail there's got to be at least 5 metres high. Really quite big. When you come around to the back here, you get to see a view that you don't normally get to see. The back of these engines. You can see all the little compression plates in there, which would spin, 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 and then thrust out the back here. Vic explained to us that this is the dump and burn, the fuel dump nozzle. The fact that they could dump and burn on this, I believe, was discovered by accident. Somebody was flying along, leaking fuel out the back of their plane, unbeknownst to them, hit the afterburners, and they had this massive flame out the back. His wingman said, dude, plane's on fire. But when they landed, no damage to the aircraft, and they decided it's a really cool party trick, so they kept doing it at various air shows and whatever around Australia, which this plane is no longer flying, so unfortunately you're not going to get to see it. But if you ever did see it, it was really an awesome thing. You could feel the heat from the afterburners, obviously flying very low, but you could feel the heat from them and you could certainly smell it. So it was quite the visceral experience. Awesome plane. Really cool. Here's the engine. Sorry, I'm just walking straight past it. So it was explained to us that this in full flight mode would burn 550 pounds of fuel per minute, which is quite a fuel, really, of gas. So quite the big, and when you consider 2 of those in there, this plane is essentially just 2 massive jet engines with a couple of seats strapped to the front of it. Awesome. Doesn't get better. Here's the helmet. That's what I wanted to show you. Might be a little bit difficult for you to see on here. Now this is the helmet that pilot was actually wearing on that day. So you can see damage to the front of it here. His visor's smashed and the top of his helmet there has just been disintegrated with the fiberglass. Testament to how good the helmets are. Here is the gentleman here, Flyboy. Quite the character, I think. I want to meet him. Went on to fly for many, many years. And you may be able to see that damage on the tail there, just a little bit better. But yeah, I imagine if he'd managed to sever that tail off, it might have been a very different story. I believe the Sabres were really heavily armoured as well, so it provided a degree of protection for the pilots, and many Sabres landed with significant battle damage, big chunks out of tail, leading edges, parts of it missing, shot up all through the side. So without that armour, I dare say a lot of those pilots would not have actually made it back. Told you we'd be here for ages.